Hello everyone, this is a review video for Ecology Lecture 5 where we talk about the 4 different kinds of nutrient cycles. So the first cycle that we talk about is the water cycle. It's quite straightforward. So let's take a look. We have precipitation, runoff, which is water running down a hill or the road that's, as long as water is flowing, you can call that runoff. And then water can also be absorbed in the soil to make groundwater or underground aquifers if you want to be extra fancy. And then you can have water flow this way and this way. And then you can have evaporation. Anytime you talk about evaporation, that's simply liquid water that you can drink, turned into gas water, which is in the air right now. There's always, when we talk about humidity of the air, that's water vapor. So liquid water turned into gas water, that's evaporation. And then we have the last one, transpiration. So transpiration is water evaporating from the leaves. We give it a special name, transpiration. Okay, so if you think about this question right here, which part of the water cycle is a biological process? The answer is transpiration. The answer is transpiration. And the reason for that is because this process involves this tree. And you can argue that evaporation can involve, let's say, sweat evaporating from your hand. That does involve an ecological organism, but evaporation itself doesn't necessarily include something living, right? But transpiration does always include something living, which is the tree. The next one that we have, the next question is transpiration and evaporation are both a part of the water cycle. How are they similar? So how are they similar? They're both water, liquid water turned into gas, into water vapor, right? How are they different? Transpiration is a biological process, and evaporation doesn't have to be. Do water molecules always follow the same steps throughout the water cycle? And the answer for that will be no, because if you look right here, our water cycle could go this way through runoff and then evaporation. That could be a full cycle, but you can also go precipitation, runoff, absorption through the soil, flow, and then absorption again, transpiration. So depending on the ecosystem and what exactly is going on in the particular situation, we can have water molecules flow in different steps, right? We don't always have to follow precipitation, runoff, evaporation. It could even be precipitation and then evaporation right away. So no is the answer. And the next one, we're on to carbon cycle. This is definitely not the carbon cycles. Here we have our carbon cycle. You understand why water is important, right? Every living thing is dependent on water. But why is carbon essential? Because they're in all the macromolecules, right? So if you look right here, what are our 4 kinds of macromolecules? We have lipid, we have carbohydrate, we have proteins, and we have nucleic acid. All 4 of those molecules and a lot of other molecules in our body are organic, which means it has carbon in there. Where do we get our carbon? If you think about it, you could breathe in carbon dioxide all the time, right? If you just blow out and then try to get some gas again, you don't get the carbon dioxide to do anything. You can breathe in the carbon dioxide that you just blow out, but it doesn't actually do anything for your body. You can't change that carbon dioxide into lipid, nucleic acid, and any other macromolecules. You have to go through other processes. That's why we talk about the carbon cycle, because it's not as simple as taking in carbon directly from the atmosphere. So if you start the carbon cycle, it's CO2 going through photosynthesis to make carbohydrates, right? While it's making carbohydrates, it's also making oxygen, and the oxygen that you're breathing in right now comes mostly from all the autotrophs that are on Earth. So thank the autotrophs, even though they don't talk and walk and all that. They're quite important. They do a great job making all the food and oxygen available for us. So CO2 comes into the tree, and CO2 during photosynthesis is made into carbohydrates, right? That's one type of organic molecule. And then it can also be turned into our lipid, proteins, nucleic acid for the tree as well. But this doesn't have to be plants, or it doesn't have to be a tree. It could be a fungi or bacteria as well. And then how do we pass on the carbon? In our next step, the carbon will then be passed on to this bunny as this bunny eats the leaves off the tree. And then the carbon can be passed down the food chain as well, right? As a wolf eats the bunny, the wolf will get carbon from the bunny to make all 4 macromolecules. If human eats the wolf, the human will get all 4 macromolecules from the wolf. So it's all a food chain. And then there's a very important word right here called respiration. So respiration is breathing, basically. So if you think about a human being breathing, right? You're breathing in oxygen, but why exactly are you breathing in oxygen? Is so that you can combine the oxygen, with the food that you eat. Let me find some food. Here's some vitamin. Combine oxygen and the food that you eat, and then you can break down the food and make energy for yourself. So this process is called respiration. You combine food with oxygen, and then you can break down the food to produce energy, to allow your cells to live, to allow your entire body to live, right? And during this process as well, we also breathe out carbon dioxide. So respiration involves breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. Don't get that backward. You cannot breathe in carbon dioxide and do anything useful with it. Then the next step is eventually the bunny is going to die. And then here's our dead bunny. This bunny will be decomposed by the decomposer. So again, we have this bunny. Bunny is back there actually. But we have the bunny, and then decomposers will decompose the bunny, right? So the bunny is kind of a food source for the decomposers, right? So then these carbon gets passed on to these decomposers, but at the same time, these decomposers also breathe out carbon dioxide. Same idea here, right? They take in food, where'd it go? They take in food combined with oxygen, break down the food, and then produce carbon dioxide and release it back in the air. So this is a whole cycle. Carbon dioxide coming in, carbon dioxide going back into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide going back into the atmosphere again. And then the dead bunny could also become fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and natural gas. And here's the problem. Through millions of years, these coal, oil, natural gas have been buried underground. But what happens when human beings are burning the fossil fuels? We're releasing a lot of carbon dioxide in the air. If you think about all those dead organisms and all the nature's activities, made all those carbon and trapped it underground. That's where it's supposed to be. And we have our atmosphere that has a certain balance of carbon dioxide, but that balance, that equilibrium, is being broken by us releasing even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So now we have an overwhelming amount of carbon dioxide and other types of greenhouse gases that's trapping all the heat and making the earth overall really warm. But as you can see, it's not exactly really warm today, right? So the greenhouse gases isn't just changing the temperature of the earth, it's also causing what we call climate change, right? It's a drastic change, and it's not normal. Our next step is we have this little cycle over here where carbon dioxide can actually, I forgot to write an arrow over here, carbon dioxide can actually come into the water, and then the carbon dioxide can be combined with this crab and become a part of the crab shell. When the crab dies, the carbon and the calcium becomes a part of the limestone, and then the limestone can dissolve and carbon dioxide goes back in the water, and carbon dioxide is a gas and it will come back into the atmosphere. So this is this whole little cycle right here. So all right, we pretty much answered all these questions already. How is human activity affecting the carbon cycle? Human activity is releasing extra CO2 in the air by burning fossil fuels. All right. So even though that's the only, focus question that we have right here, you need to make sure that you understand this entire cycle, because you might see a picture of this cycle and I'm going to ask you to identify certain parts of the cycle and explain to me what is happening in this process, right? What's going to what's happening. So all the parts of this cycle, you need to make sure that you understand it. All right, our next one is our nitrogen cycle. Carbon is in every single macromolecule. Nitrogen is not in every single macromolecule, but they're still very important because without nitrogen, there wouldn't be any nucleic acid, which is DNA, RNA, which is the blueprint of our body. If there's no nucleic acid, there's no DNA. There wouldn't be us at all. I don't know what we're going to be. Probably some slimy, I don't know. But nitrogen is also in protein, and protein is absolutely essential for every single living organism. So it's good to have some nitrogen, right? And nitrogen is I don't know what I'm saying. Nitrogen is also another nutrient cycle that we can see over here. So if you look right here, that's our first nitrogen fixation. So what exactly is nitrogen fixation? Here's what you need to know, okay? We talked about this in class already, but you need to make sure that you understand what are the things that I need to focus on. First, N2 is nitrogen gas. N2 is all over the atmosphere. However, we have other organisms to help us actually get nitrogen elsewhere. Why don't we just breathe in nitrogen and use it in our body and make DNA, RNA, proteins? Because it doesn't work that way. The nitrogen in the air doesn't actually do anything for us. When we breathe in nitrogen, we breathe it right out. It's just how our body evolved to be. It's evolved to be this way, but that's fine. That that give us the opportunity to eat all this good food, right? So here we go. N2, what you need to remember is N2 cannot be used in your body or most living organisms' body. So we have to go through some process called nitrogen fixation. Say nitrogen fixation 3 times. Nitrogen fixation, nitrogen fixation, nitrogen fixation. So what is it? It turns N2, which is an unusable form of nitrogen, into NO3, which is a usable form of nitrogen that our body can actually use to make nucleic acid and protein. And that's a great thing because that allows us to live, and anything that allows us to live is pretty nice. Here we have a volcanic eruption that does basically the same thing. It turns N2, which is unusable, into a usable form. Okay? Next step. Obviously, not all of us live under a lightning or a volcano all the time. So how do we get our nutrients? But before we can talk about our nitrogen, we have to talk about some plants. Plants are really important, in case you haven't found out. So here we have 2 different kinds of plants. We have the legume plant and the non-legume plant. The difference is, first off, so let's first talk about a similarity. They both use bacteria to do nitrogen fixation or nitrification. You can just remember nitrogen fixation. All right, nitrogen fixation, again, turns nitrogen, N2, into another form of nitrogen that actually can be used by organisms. So that's what bacteria does. Well, that's what a lot of bacteria does, okay? The difference between legume and non-legume plant is that for legume plants, we have all these roots of the legume plants, and the bacteria lives right on the roots. So the bacteria can do the nitrogen fixation, turning N2 into NH4, and then the roots can directly absorb the NH4, the usable form of nitrogen, from the bacteria, directly from the roots, okay? Here's how non-legume plant is different. Non-legume plant also have roots, but the bacteria are not on the root. Instead, they're in the soil. So they're spread out in the soil, okay? When these bacteria make the usable form of nitrogen, that nitrogen that nitrogen can be absorbed by the roots from the soil. See the difference? Legume plants, you have bacteria living on the roots of the plant, and then the plant can get nitrogen that way. For non-legume plant, the bacteria is not on the roots, but your roots can still absorb nitrogen. Okay? And so make sure you understand the difference between legume and non-legume plant. Either way, down the food chain, we can have herbivores or omnivores eating your plants, and then nitrogen get passed down to this rabbit in this case, and then when other organisms eat this rabbit, the nitrogen gets passed down the food chain, and then when this rabbit urinates or makes waste, this nitrogen gets passed down to the waste. And then when the rabbit dies, the decomposers are going to decompose this dead rabbit. Okay, so if you have, I do not have a rabbit here, but if you have this rabbit, right, we're decomposing it, we're taking everything apart, we're putting everything back into the beginning of life. And what's happening? Here we have a new word called denitrification, or denitrifying bacteria. It does denitrification. So denitrification is turning the NO3 and NH4 back into N2, and then send this N2 back into the atmosphere. So now we have a full cycle. We have nitrogen in the air coming into plants, coming into the animals, down the food chain, and then gets recycled back into the air. Okay? So let's take a look at the questions that we can focus on. Nitrogen fixation is carried out primarily by what type of organism? What is it? Bacteria. Or if you want to be extra fancy, you can call it nitrogen fixing bacteria. Next one. Whoa. Can animals consume nitrogen directly from the air? You all know the answer is no. If not, where can animals obtain nitrogen? From food. Okay, that's one reason why we eat food, is to get nitrogen. It's quite nice. All right, how do humans affect the nitrogen cycle? First off, we produce waste. Right? When we produce waste, the nitrogen goes into the waste. But also, we use too much fertilizer. So if you think about a fertilizer, the fertilizer has nitrogen because a lot of the times the soil doesn't have enough nitrogen, or you don't have enough of these nitrogen fixing bacteria to produce nitrogen for your plants. And if your plants do not get enough nitrogens, they cannot live. You can't get enough plants if you were to be a farmer. Luckily, none of us is a farmer at the time. It's a lot of work, okay? But we putting those fertilizers in the soil so that we can have healthy plants. We can make a lot of food for other human beings. So then we use the fertilizers. But that's a problem. And then we'll see why that's a problem when we get to over here. Well, actually, let's jump to over here. So you can call nitrogen a limiting factor. A limiting factor is some factor that can limit productivity. So what is productivity? Productivity is how much product you can have. But specifically, we're talking about, if you're a farmer, how much plants you can get to produce. If you were to be a breeder of some animal, how many animals can you have? So examples of productivity, there's nitrogen, there is phosphorus, and there is potassium. So all those are important for plants to live, but we don't have enough of that in our soil a lot of the times. Why do we add limiting nutrients during farming? To increase productivity. What is the effect of using excess limiting nutrients? The answer will be algae bloom. Oh, what happened? Oh. The answer will be algae bloom. So what is algae bloom? What's happening? We did this in class, right? If you have a lot of fertilizers, excess, which means extra fertilizer, that will cause, eventually, if you have too much fertilizer, a lot of those fertilizers can be left in the soil, right? So then if it's in the soil and it rains, or you water your plants, you could have runoff of the nutrients. And then the nutrients enter water. So now your ponds and the ocean will have too much nutrients, and this will cause an algae bloom, because the algae will then use the nutrients and then produce way too much algae. But eventually, the algae dies. So this will be right here. Algae dies. A lot of that algae will die, but if you remember our carbon cycle, when something dies, the decomposers are going to decompose and use a lot of oxygen and produce a lot of carbon dioxide. So when the algae dies, decomposer break down dead algae and take up a lot of oxygen and release a lot of carbon dioxide. Why is that a problem? Now you're going to have an oxygen deficiency in water. Now all the fish die, and then whatever organism that's dependent on the fish, right? There could be people, there could be the other bird, but remember, the world occupies in a food web, and if one organism dies, the next one is not gonna live very well either. So that's a whole problem. Okay, so make sure you understand how algae bloom works. So what biological process converts nitrogen gas into ammonia? Right here, nitrogen gas to ammonia. What is it called? Nitrogen fixation. This is our, I don't even know how many times we've said this. Nitrogen fixation. Why do living things need nitrogen? For nucleic acid and proteins. So DNA, RNA, enzymes. Okay, it's good enough. All right. What would happen if the process in the nitrogen cycle stops? So if you think about, if we get rid of this process, if we get rid of this process, if we get rid of any of these processes, then you wouldn't be able to get any nitrogen if nitrogen fixation doesn't happen. Or if you disrupt the food chain and you don't get any food, then you don't get any nitrogen. That means you will not live. So I would say everyone dies. Looks like in here we completely ignored phosphorus cycle, but we should look at it anyway because it might be on the test. I might give you this a picture of the phosphorus cycle and have you identify what step it is. So let's take a look real quick. We have undersea sedimentary rock shift up during tectonic plate movement. So all these plates are moving, and then the rocks are shifting up and something's being released into the ocean. And the one that we worry about right here is phosphorus. Phosphorus is then absorbed by soil and rock. This is absorption happening. H2O dissolve. So H2O is dissolving the soil and the rock. So now the phosphorus in your lake and ocean. And now your plants can absorb the phosphorus, right? Because as human or rabbit, we don't really just drink water that has phosphorus in it. It doesn't really work that way. But plants absorb phosphorus, and then the phosphorus is passed down the food chain, passed down to the waste. When the bunny dies, we have something called organic decay, which breaks down the phosphorus, and then the phosphorus can dissolve back into water. Why is phosphorus important? DNA and RNA. You definitely want every single one of those macromolecules, and this is why all four of these nutrient cycles are very important for us to learn and to understand. Okay, bye.